Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the Van Andel Institute for Education's free webinar series. You have landed on our page. My name is Michael Grebe. I'm a K-12 learning specialist here at the Van Andel Institute, and I'm super excited you're joining me today because today we are going to be talking about something that I'm super passionate in, and I know by the end of the day you are too. We are going to be talking about 5 powerful ways to link your STEM lessons to real-world applications. Before we get into the free content, I just have a couple of notes I would like to go over. Today's broadcast is being recorded, meaning if you like today or you want to pass it along to a friend, you are always free to rewatch, share out to your friends because it's being recorded. That recording can actually be found in a hyperdoc that is going to be sent in the chat just about now. That hyperdoc is going to have all my slides, all the resources we talk about in the link to that recording so that you have it for the future, or again, if you want to share it, it's there for you then. In the background, behind the curtain, is Heather. Heather, would you like to say hi to everybody?
Hi, everybody. I just sent that hyperlink to the resources doc. Enjoy the webinar.
Awesome. Heather is going to be in the background, so if you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free to drop that in the comments, and Heather will be happy to help you out. Of course, I told you today's webinar is free. This is one of our free resources, and it is all brought to you by our sponsor for today, the Inquiry Outpost. The Inquiry Outpost is a marketplace for teachers just like you, where they have practical, time-saving resources to promote curiosity, critical thinking, and creativity in your classroom. My favorite, actually my favorite product off of this is our STEM challenge cards. Our STEM challenge cards, you can break them out, whether it's that 15 minutes at the end of that lesson that you're not too sure what to do with, or if you want to build an entire 2-hour lesson around, you can break out one of those cards with just a few classroom materials. You can have an awesome STEM challenge for you and your students. So we would really appreciate your support there. In fact, if you drop the code THANK-U in the Inquiry Outpost, you will receive 20% off your purchase. You can go to vaieducation.org, that is vaieducation.org, to check out our sponsor. Your support is much appreciated. Now, let's get back to that free content. Before we start the free content, I kind of want to just gauge the room here, see how I can shift my material to adapt the needs of you best. In just a second, a poll is going to pop up on your screen. I'm curious just to see who is in the room. Are you from early elementary, K through 2? Are you upper elementary, 3rd through 5th? Middle school, 6th through 8th, high school, 9, 12, or admin or other position? Go ahead and just take a second.
Just watching the results come in. Awesome. And I'm going to close it in a couple seconds.
A couple more seconds here. Get your poll in so I can adapt my content. Heather, how are we looking?
It looks like we have 24% is early L, 47 is upper L, 41 middle school, no high school this time, and 6% is admin or other.
Awesome. Thank you for taking a look at that poll with me. That's really going to help me sort of adjust the content so I can really narrow these resources down so that you can actually use them. So today we're going to be talking about 3 really main things. We're going to be talking about a question. From that question, we're going to kind of frame why it's important to actually make those real-world connections in your classroom. And then finally, we're going to get to those 5 super powerful ways that you can use this strategy in your classroom. So there is a question that goes around classrooms, and I know no matter what content area you teach, no matter what age grade, what grade band you teach, I know you have encountered this question. Can you think of the question I'm thinking about? It's not, can I go to the restroom? It's not, can I borrow a pencil? If you know this question that I'm talking about, please say it out loud. We're talking about real-world connections. I get this question all the time. Mr. G, why are we learning this? This is totally a fair question, right? Even in our adult lives, we have this question. So it's fair for students to also share this curiosity about our lesson. Now, if you're anything like me, I usually see about 2 responses to this question. Usually the teacher either goes on a side tangent, 20 minutes, going into why their content's important. By the 30 seconds in, the student's checked out and they don't really have their question answered. The second way, right, and I know I've opted into this before, not the best way, but I've definitely done it. Well, it's going to be on the test. You are going to need to know it on the test. That's why we're learning it today, so it's really important for you. Well, if I'm a student that doesn't find that test very important and you just linked, right, your activity to that test, I also probably am not going to be super engaged in your lesson. So here's the problem that we're going to be focusing on today. The problem that we see is, here's the awesome educators. That's you in the camera right there. You are delivering your awesome lesson. Now, over the 15 years, 7 years, maybe 2 years perfecting your lesson, you're able to hook your students pretty good, right? That first 5 to 10 minutes, each student is super engaged. It's something new. It's maybe a picture that you showed them. It's a concept maybe they haven't thought about before. So they're super engaged. But then that question pops up. There he is right there, whether it's peer-to-peer. Hey, why are we doing this? Or maybe somebody's bold enough and actually asks you out loud, man, why are we learning this, right? Where is this going to take us? If you don't either have a good answer, or maybe you haven't allowed your students to think through that answer themselves, your classroom, I know my classroom has looked like this before. Your students are going to lose all legitimacy in your lesson, right? They're going to become disengaged. There's not going to be a pathway that they see themselves being successful with the lesson you're delivering. So here's what I'm proposing. If we build those real world connections, that question that students have, Mr. G, why are we doing this? This helps them discover, right, why we are actually doing these things. So this solution starts all the same. That's you, that's the rockstar teacher. There's your beginning engagement, right? You got the students going at first. Oh, the question doesn't look different, right? Same question, Mr. G, why are we doing this? But now, right, because you've used maybe one of these 5 strategies, you've set your students up so that they can see success, right? They can see legitimacy in their lesson. They can see how you, in your lesson, is helping them obtain something, right, for the future, right? It's helping them in the future. So what are those 5 ways to connect your STEM lesson to the real world for your students so they see that legitimacy? The first one, this is something I call the everyday enigma. I had a chemistry teacher that did this strategy flawlessly. One day, he showed up and he plopped one of these on our table. Do you know what it is? Take a guess, say it out loud. So this object, like you, I was very confused about, but this object was physically on my table. Now, my chemistry teacher later went on to say that this is, if you're unfamiliar, this is a catalytic converter off of a vehicle, right? And essentially what it does is it takes harmful gas from your engine, reacts it with some precious metals, and makes an exhaust that's a little less harmful. But what my chemistry teacher did with this object is he framed his entire STEM lesson around it. So gave us an object that we're not so much familiar with, but we definitely interact with, right? Who drove a car, a gasoline car, in to school today, right? Everybody interacted with that. So this piece of something that we interact with daily, right, we want to understand more about. So he framed his entire lesson, right? We can talk about reactions, right? Going through the catalytic converter, those different reactions that go on in there, right? We can talk about phase changes from gasoline to vapor to explosive, right? In those different reactants and reagents in there. So what he did is he took this object that was from a familiar thing from our everyday lives, and he framed, right, this entire lesson around it. So when students asked that question, Mr. G, why are we doing this? They were able to see that they were taking small incremental steps to understanding this object before them. Now, you guys told me that there's a lot of elementary school teachers in here, right? So what I wanted to do is maybe propose a couple more examples that obviously we're not slapping a catalytic converter in front of kindergartners, right? So what are some other things that we could use? You could use familiar landmarks. So actually at the old school that I taught at, there was the water tower just outside, right? And the water tower has all sorts of sciencey stuff going on with it, whether it's water quality, whether talking about water pressure, right? Maybe forces in there somewhere. So use a familiar object that maybe students don't really understand how it works and base your lesson around that. Here's another idea. Maybe you can use a stove. I know a stove, right? Students probably interact with pretty regularly. Maybe not an exciting object, right? But if you build your lesson around it and you take those concepts that you need to teach, right? Need to teach, and you apply them to something that a student uses daily, they then see value. Every time they walk past that stove, they're going to think about convection or conduction or whatever you build it around. Now, my tip here is start small, right? Don't do this for your entire unit. Maybe start with one lesson, right? And always have that physical object to refer back to. Find something that has many elements that everybody uses that you can connect your STEM lesson to. That is the everyday enigma. The second one is called the interest intersects. Now, I had a student, and it seemed like the only thing they cared about was soccer. Right? Soccer was it for them. Essentially, they had to do what they had to do in order to play the soccer game later in the week, right? So it seemed to them that these were two entirely different realms, right? When a student's super interested in soccer and I'm trying to push sciencey concepts onto them, sometimes those two things can feel like this, right? Where you have all of your students' interests on one side and you're sort of this sciencey side of it that's kind of battling all the time, right? Butting heads. But we know as educators, the best way to do this is to take these two worlds and blend them hopefully seamlessly, right? So we have our artists that are seeing connections in science. We have our athletes who are seeing connections between the hobbies that they like to do, right? And the actual concepts that are in your lesson. So how can we do this? A great way to blend your students' lesson to their hobby is, I love to do this. I used to do this just about once every 2 weeks, right? Every time we sort of switched to a different concept, I would do this just as a super informal check-in. I did student interest posters. Now I challenge my students to create just a mini poster, right? Super low tech here, right? Just a piece of paper, some colored pencils. If you can do that, you can do this strategy. On this piece of poster, have them try to find a connection between the hobby of theirs and the concept that they are learning. This not only helps them build that connection in their brain, right? Oh, I like soccer. Oh, hey, we're learning about forces in science class, right? How can I blend those two together? Oh, every time I kick the ball, right? There's some sort of force exchange there. So that not only builds the connection in their brain with the real world concept, but also at the end of the day, I had all these papers of all of my students' interests. So if you really struggled maybe connecting with that one student, all of a sudden you have a poster, right, that has their hobby on it that connects to your content. Hey, maybe that's the next conversation starter next time you see that student. So this is a super low-tech way that you can do it. Also along the interest intersect, I know my elementary friends may really enjoy this one. We do one called the relevant elephant. Essentially what this is we print off like a big poster-sized board of an elephant, right? And on that elephant, we have 3 different sort of concepts that we're learning. And essentially what I do is I invite the students to come up to the elephant and write down underneath each concept, right, how that concept is being used either in their current life or in their future life. This sort of lets students, I always say irrelevant, right? It sort of lets them sort out irrelevant maybe connections that they have to the real world, but then it allows them to actually piece together those real connections that they see to the world, right? That way, that's always posted at the front of my classroom. Students are always going up to it, maybe checking out what other people wrote, but it's also a good thing just to have kind of on the sideboard, right? Oh, wait a second, let's pulse the brakes here. Why do you think I'm having you learn this, right? I'm afraid what I'm teaching you is irrelevant. How can we make it relevant, right? Who has a good example from their lives that we can talk about these concepts through? That's how you can make that real world connection for maybe a little bit younger students. This is something super fun, kind of silly to have up on the board, right? But it sparks some really great conversation. So that is the relevant elephant. My third strategy for you today is get an expert. Now, I know this probably has come up to you before, right? Of course, in order to make a real world connection, bring somebody from the real world into your classroom to talk, right? But we know sometimes it's not as easy as it's cracked up to be, and there's all sorts of logistical sort of things that come with it. So I'm going to suggest a few things. So get an expert is a great way to connect to real world connections for your students. Now you can do this by reaching out to different community members. If you have any science clinics, health clinics, waste centers are a great spot, dentistry offices, engineering and construction firms, nature centers, museums. These are filled with people who probably use some element of STEM in their day-to-day, right? If you bring in somebody who works a day-to-day that uses the concepts that your students are learning in class and they all of a sudden talk about it, maybe this legitimizes your lesson for those students, right? Maybe what the scientists have to say, maybe that's enough of a buy-in, right? To get your students invested into your content. Now, this is easier said than done, right? We know that we have lots of time, right? Yeah, probably not, right? We don't have a whole lot of time. I don't want to be sitting there emailing a bunch of different firms, right? Just asking for some interest to come visit my classroom. So I have a tip for you. I have done the hard work for you, and your students are going to do the other side of the hard work. In the HyperDoc, I have this community partner survey. We love to use this with all of our PBL projects. Essentially what you do is you send the survey home with the student. Don't go around calling up places, trying to find somebody to connect to. Of course, if you have time for that, go for it. But this survey allows you to shift that workload onto students to go find themselves an expert. Then, once that expert comes in, it's more legit, right? Students went after that expert. They sought them out. They got them into the classroom. Now, all of a sudden, this expert's making awesome connections, right, to our content. And overall, the real world connection for our students is more apparent. This document you can find in that hyperlink that is left in the chat. Feel free to use that survey, print it off, give it to your kiddos, and send them home with it. You'll be amazed at what you'll come up with. Maybe you don't have time for any of that, right? Maybe you're looking for something a little bit different. Because you're looking for something a little bit different, I'm going to suggest something a little bit different. So stick with me here. If you want to maybe do this tomorrow, right? Or maybe you can't find enough interest with that survey, here is my tip to you. I recommend training in AI PERT. Okay, that didn't roll off the tongue quite the way I wanted it to. But an AI PERT is an expert, right, that we can train an AI model. So if your school is just getting sort of into using AI, this might be a great option for you. With just a simple prompt over here, right, I teach blah, blah, blah grade, and we are learning about blah, blah, blah. I want you to be an expert scientist that can answer my students' questions and pique their curiosity, creativity, and critical thinking with real world connections around our subject. If you type this prompt into School AI and send that over to your students, all of a sudden, in front of your student, they have a real world expert to answer their problems. So maybe you want them to consult this expert about maybe a project they're working on, right? This AI gives very personalized feedback to the student, right? So you can see there, I dropped like, I'm not much of an animal person, right? So the AI will take that information and try to swap out for some more examples, right? So now it's talking about fruits and vegetables there at the very bottom of the prompt. So this getting an AI PERT, again, didn't roll off as smooth as I want, but if you bring this into your classroom, students will be able to actively, right, maybe a scaffolded sort of sorting of information. This is a great way to get an expert into your classroom. All right, I got one more silly one for you. If you are still down the AI track, here is what you can also do. Sometimes an expert isn't always a scientist, right? Maybe our students are more into maybe pop culture stuff. Maybe I teach really young students, right? So maybe they would get more value out of maybe characters in a book, or maybe a movie that they're familiar with, maybe something along those lines, right? So what you can do is you can take that interest, right, the expert interest, and maybe let's make it a character that they're familiar with. This is Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. With just a simple prompt into something like School AI, create a lesson plan about the rock cycle for 7th graders. I want the lesson to draw a metaphorical connection between the rock cycle and the typical story arc of the movies of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Now all of a sudden, we've called an expert, kind of a celebrity, but still the idea, right? The students have the investment already on this character. So what AI is going to do is they're probably going to spit out a pretty silly image of maybe your celebrity linked with exactly what you just told it. And it's going to give you an overview or a story that you can frame your lesson around so that the expert, or in this case, kind of a celebrity character, right, is the focus of it. If they have that focus of it, your students have the buy-in to something that's already familiar to them, so they can maybe grasp your science lesson a little bit better. My 4th strategy I'm going to share with you today is called problem to progress. It looks like this. I used to work in a school, and in that school, there was a music teacher that came up to me. He knew I was super into STEM, super into engineering challenges. And essentially, the problem here was this music educator had a problem of pencils always falling off music stands, right? So throughout the day while the band's playing, the pencils would fall off the stand, and by the time the custodial staff came through and picked up all the pencils were gone the next day, right? So what did the music instructor hear the next day? Hey, can we borrow a pencil? I don't have a pencil. So here is a local problem, right? A music educator is reaching out to me that was in that school, right, to maybe fix a problem. I was like, hey, you know what? I bet my 5th graders can come up with a solution. So what I did is I took a local problem and I ran it through this engineering design cycle, right? If you're unfamiliar with the engineering design cycle, you can find this resource in the hyperdoc. But essentially what we did here, right, is we took that problem and I had my 5th graders try to solve it. Now, the biggest part of this whole engineering cycle today is that application piece. You see that application piece in that top left-hand corner? This is a piece that I feel like some STEM teachers sort of skip out on, but I'm going to argue that it's the most important piece, the application. Because when my 5th graders came up with a solution, right, for my music educator friend, the students were actually able to see how their project was applicable, right, to a local problem that we had. So they saw it in action. In fact, it was super cool. They invited us down to the band room. The band played a couple songs for us, right, and they were super, my 5th graders were super geeked out because not only were their pencils being used, right, in the pencil holders that they made, but they got to kind of have a day out, collaborated at different grade bands, right? So this is a great idea. So the idea here is that you can identify a local problem. That I feel like is super easy. Go around the school. Is there a little gadget that maybe some teachers need? Hey, maybe my teacher next door is having a really tough time with their turn-in bins, right? Maybe there's something we can invent, or maybe something we can design to help clean up that turn-in area back there, right? So once we have identified a local problem, we're going to come up with a relevant engineering challenge. A lot of times STEM teachers want to give engineering challenges that maybe are a little disconnected, right? Maybe if you give your students a Hoover Dam, right, engineering challenge, well, if you don't live next to the Hoover Dam, it's probably going to be kind of a stretch, right, if you don't frame it correctly. So we have a local problem, right, that's here and now. We're going to create a relevant engineering challenge. And finally, we're going to see the progress, right? I'm going to let my students go down to that room and see how what they designed is helping out our fellow teacher, our fellow students, and ultimately our school, right? Great way to bring community together here. So that is called problem to progress. My final one for you today, the 5th one. I know we've all heard this before, but stick with me here. The 5th one is called project-based learning. Now, I know you've heard about this before. I know you've heard about this before, but I feel like I would be missing something if I didn't at least mention it once. So project-based learning, remember, is this idea that we're creating a project for our students. It's driven by inquiry, right? It's driven by authentic audiences, and we're coming up with a product that students, or maybe a project product, maybe a flyer, right? Something tangible that students can be proud of and that they can take ownership in. This allows the students to make those contributions to the real world. Your students, they want to make contributions. So let's let them through project-based learning, sometimes called authentic learning, right? So we want that tangible outcome that students can actually see. And here's that big piece, right? That inquiry focused. We want students for themselves. Mr. G, why are we doing this? We want them to discover that in their minds, right? So we can set up this lesson, right? That's more project-based approach that allows them to see it. Now, I have news for you. If you've done my previous two strategies, which were an authentic audience and problem to progress, you've already taken two really big baby steps toward a project-based learning basis, right? Because we know that project-based learning takes a lot of time. So I would start with those first two, right? Get an expert in your classroom. Maybe the next year that expert's coming back. Maybe because that expert's coming back, we can add in another element, right? We can come up with that problem piece. If you've had those two things, that other thing that you're missing is the inquiry, right? And that will naturally come with it. So to build out these PBLs, it takes a lot of time, right? And as educators, again, we talked about it before, we know how much time we have. You can either start the baby steps yourself, right, and sort of accumulate it over the year, or I have something better. Our sponsor today, I told you, was the Inquiry Outpost. The Inquiry Outpost has these things called Blue Apple projects. Essentially, these are built out PBL projects for you to use in your classroom. So we have a bunch of them on there. Feel free to maybe try one of them out, right? And then maybe the next year you want to build from scratch. But this is a great way to sort of get your feet wet, right? Maybe dip your toe in the water a little bit, see how you like it, see maybe how you can build it out to be specific for your students. Now let's jump back just very quickly to that inquiry piece, right? That inquiry piece is that piece of project-based learning that's really going to help us here. Again, Mr. G, why are we doing this? Well, now they know, because students are that driving role to determine the process for learning, right? You're giving them a project, you're giving them different angles to attack that project at, and they don't necessarily know what the answer is, but they are discovering it as they go. That little loop of discovery is what's going to drive your students to make those authentic learning experiences. And naturally, right, if we're bringing in an expert, if we're bringing authentic problems in, they're going to see that value in the real world, and they're going to find value in your own lesson. Teachers and students construct meaning by journaling, right? We kind of talked about the relevant elephant. This is an excellent example of that. Have check-ins with them, right? Hey, listen, guys, I'm a little bit afraid that this isn't going to help you later on. Help me brainstorm ways, right? Help me brainstorm ways that this is relevant. Where can you see this fitting into your lives? If you turn that onto your students to figure it out, instead of you trying to answer that question for them, it's going to be so much more powerful. If you liked today's webinar, we have another one coming up very soon here. Wednesday, March 5th, mark your calendars at same time, same place, 4 o'clock. We have an Elevating Student Voices in Leadership for K through 12 administrators, but of course, everybody's welcome to that. So if that's something you're interested in, definitely check those out. Definitely check out our other on-demand videos, right? If you like this webinar, we have a whole series of them that we would love for you to check out. And of course, they're free. One more note from the sponsor. Don't forget about our sponsor today. This is the Inquiry Outpost. You can find the Inquiry Outpost at vaieducation.org. That is vaieducation.org. If you use that promo code THANK-U, you are going to save yourself 20% on the Inquiry Outpost. And that includes our PBLs, right? So utilize that resource. I know you guys will enjoy it. My final thing. I would just like to thank you. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for taking an interest in your students' interests, right? And thank you for trying to build the best classroom possible. In just a second, this webinar is going to close out and there's going to be a survey that pops up. I would love to get your thoughts on that. Love for you to fill that out for me. Again, my name is Michael. I'm a learning specialist. Feel free to reach out to me. That's my email address right there. It's also on that hyperdoc. If you need help maybe brainstorming ways to maybe make one of these strategies and mold it into something that fits you, please do not hesitate to reach out. Again, thank you for joining us on this webinar. We hope to see you in the next one.